my senator friends to come on down. So really pleased to have Senator Norm Coleman and Senator Daschle be with us. They're friends of CSIS and friends of mine. Thanks for doing this. Thanks, Senator. Thank you. We wanted to have this conversation in the context of that we had always done foreign assistance as part of enlightened self-interest. That we've always done it out of generosity, but we've also engaged in foreign assistance because it's in our long-term interest to do so. Senator Vandenberg understood this, and there had to be a case made. There was an enormous selling job that happened in the late 1940s to carry out, to get the Marshall Plan done. I think there was the scare of the Czechoslovakia coup, but there were also something like 100 congressional delegations that went to Europe, 100 congressional delegations. Richard Nixon was a freshman member of Congress and went to Italy to see the war-ravaged Italy. Made an enormous impact on members of Congress. We had to sell the United States on doing this. And there was a broad public education campaign as well. But the fear was if we didn't do this, that many countries in Western Europe were going to fall to the Soviet Union, in addition to the fact that these countries were devastated. So there was always a, let's call it a security or a national interest component, but there was always a humanitarian impulse as well. And it's always been that way, I think, in the way we think about our assistance. And I think that's true today. But the world has changed. There's lots of, my line here is that it's not your grandparents' developing world in some ways, that it's richer, freer, more capable, and to the extent we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of countries, they'll take their business to China. And I think that's something else we should talk about in this conversation. But at the same time, we still need soft power. We need certain forms of soft power for any number of different challenges, whether it's forced migration, whether it's pandemics, whether it's feeding 9.5 billion people, any number of different challenges that we have in the world, and the challenges of closed and closing societies, the challenges of human rights. There's a whole series of reasons why we engage in using our soft power. Senator Vandenberg saw it, and we still see that today. And we just had this conversation at lunch that you both were kind enough to participate in to see this as well. So I just would ask each of you to talk about when you were each in the Senate, how you each saw foreign assistance, and what was your rationale for supporting it when you were in the Senate? So Senator Daschle, let me start with you.
Well, I think a lot of the, first of all, let me thank you, Dan, for hosting this, and thank Hank especially for his sponsorship, and appreciate very much the attendance on a busy afternoon. I think many of the motivations that you described around Senator Vandenberg are every bit as evident and as important today. We do see foreign assistance in many contexts. There's obviously a great deal of support for foreign assistance for the right reason. It's the right thing to do. It's the response to needs that we see all over the world. I think there's also been an international competition context. Before 1992 or so, it was the Cold War. After 1992, it's become both economic as well as military and strategic. China has increasingly become sort of our competitor as we look for worldwide dominance, and that's certainly been a big motivation. I come from a farm state, South Dakota, and agriculture is by far our biggest industry, and there's always been a recognition in agriculture that we produce a lot more food than we can consume. And so it's critical for us to find markets abroad, and foreign assistance and the Food for Peace program and so many other programs like it were a major factor in the motivation for people in my part of the country. And then finally, I think people sometimes misunderstand or don't fully appreciate the enormity of the challenge we face in either man-made or in natural circumstances involving pandemics. Pandemics have killed more people in the last century than all the wars put together. And our appreciation of the need for interaction and interconnectedness and ultimately now integration could not be more important than we consider the ramifications of another pandemic. We saw it to a certain extent with Ebola and Zika. We saw it, of course, with smallpox, with 80 million people who lost their lives in the early 1900s. And so there's clearly a real appreciation here, too, of security in another context. But I think I'll end, Dan, with a point that I think really needs to be emphasized. Members of Congress turn over a lot. We have over 100 new members of the House of Representatives after the last election. More than 200 people have been sworn in the Senate since I was sworn in. And so there's an enormous degree of need for education, for a need to bring to a higher level people's understanding of the importance of these issues. And first and foremost, I think it's critical that we really recognize the importance of compromise, that compromise is the essence, it's the oxygen of democracy. And without compromise, you have the kind of dysfunction that we've seen too much of in recent years.
Great. Senator Coleman, thanks for being here.
Great.
I'm really happy you're here. You co-chair the U.S. Global Leadership Campaign, so you know something about foreign assistance. How did you decide to get involved in these issues, and what was the rationale when you were in the Senate for supporting foreign assistance?
So I'll speak on personal, but I do want to start by thanking you, Dan, for the opportunity. Hank, I brought my copy of the book. I want to show it off. So this is the definitive biography of Vandenberg, and I've been reading it, and it's fabulous. And I take pride Vandenberg was Republican. That's a good thing from my perspective. And I want to say it's also a pleasure to be here with my friend Tom Daschle. And in this time of a real partisan divide, getting almost brutal at times, I really appreciate the fact that Tom and I served together. We didn't always agree, and we fought over issues, but on a personal level, I always had the greatest respect for him, and so it's a pleasure to be on this platform with him. On a personal level, so when I got elected to Senate, the thing that motivated me was to be involved in the conversation about America's place in the world. That's not what motivates everybody. By the way, I would have been the next chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee had my election turned out 313 votes different after a 9-month recount. But by the way, so Bob Corker was behind me, and Bob would always say, Senator Corker would always say, you know, Norm, we really miss you here, but not that much, because if you were here, I wouldn't be the chairman of the committee. But that's what kind of moved me, and I had the pleasure to be there, and Tom was there for part of that time. But MCC, Millennium Challenge, we were there when it was created, and it was controversial. We're really going to require certain standards, and are we going to involve in this conversation? So we did, and by the way, MCC is a good thing, and for those who worry about effectiveness of foreign assistance, that I think has gone a long way to saying, listen, we've got criteria and standards, we hold folks to that. I was there in the very first CODEL after President Bush announced his $15 billion commitment to PEPFAR, to fighting AIDS, and I was there with a bipartisan, high-level delegation. And this was a time, by the way, I remember going there. South Africa didn't recognize the relationship between HIV and AIDS. They refused to. And we went to the largest public hospital in the world, and it was brutal. It was brutal. And then you saw in Botswana, where they were actually kind of making strides in that area, the difference. And today, a huge difference, so on all those levels, it has always been part of kind of what motivated me. And I continue today. I serve for 9 years in National Endowment for Democracy. I serve now as co-chair of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which, by the way, brings together the elements that I think are important. One, it is in our strategic military interest. General Mattis says if I didn't have support for the State Department, I'd need more aircraft carriers. Okay, support our diplomats, as Tom has spoken about. It is economic. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. I represent a state that is a farm state, but also, by the way, a global international, 3M, Medtronic, Cargill, all in my state. And so the economy is important. And on the third aspect is simply the humanitarian. The great support we get from the evangelical community. Folks actually believe in, by the way, even of all faiths, Jewish and Christian, whatever, but we really believe that too much is given, much is expected. And so for all those reasons, it has moved me. Let me just kind of present then the challenge. The challenge that concerns me, the greatest challenge is the separating, the moving away from a bipartisan approach in Congress, because I think you need folks on both sides of the aisle to support this. And as Democrats sit in their corner, Republicans sit in their corner, as the extremes of both parties become the loudest voices, one of the legacies of Vandenberg, what he was, he's the man in the middle. They have the capacity to bring people together, to work both sides of the aisle. And I think that's as important today, or even more important, because of the environment in which we are operating, than it was then. And I think having that ability to work both sides of the aisle, a bipartisan approach, a shared vision, will allow us to continue to be, I think, the greatest country in the world, and one that is capable of doing the things that we're doing with foreign assistance.
Let me ask each of you about the role of the Congress in foreign assistance and soft power. There's the Trump administration has put forward budgets with proposed cuts of as much as 30%. The Congress has in each case in the last 2 years said no and has pushed back against that. So there's absolutely, it's a co-equal branch, has said no to that. And I think that's partially also been a function of organizations like the U.S. Global Leadership Campaign. I think a broad spectrum of support across Republicans and Democrats understanding the value of foreign assistance. Could you each just talk a little bit about the role of Congress today and also the role of the committees? And then there was a question put from my colleague Louis Lauder about where are we going to find the next Vandenberg. So talk a little bit about this issue of the role of the Congress, the role of committees, and how are we going to find another Vandenberg anytime soon? Let me start with you, Senator Coleman. Let me start with you now.
Let me take this as the role of Congress. Congress has done what it should do. We have 3 branches of government, and Congress sees itself as the co-equal. The executive doesn't always see it that way, and in many ways, Congress oftentimes cedes power to the executive. But in this area, they've actually done what they should do. And so, when the president issues a budget, it is a suggestion to Congress. That's all it is. And then Congress acts, and in this area, in a bipartisan way, in a bicameral way, to actually, instead of acceding to the cuts, to actually increase, I think 4%, but an increase of what is actually asked by the administration. And so, in that sense, I applaud Congress. I understand the administration and the budget directives, they've got to kind of hold the line, but they're really, it is in America's interest to do the things that we do with foreign assistance. It is in our economic interest. It is in our security interest. It is in our humanitarian interest. There is a discussion, I just have to say, that I think is legitimate, and that is about effectiveness. How effective is foreign aid and foreign assistance? And I think that's the question there, by the way, is how do you measure effectiveness? Do you measure effectiveness by whether folks vote with us in the UN? Does that mean it's effectiveness? Or do you measure effectiveness as to whether they're wasted dollars? So I think that's a legitimate discussion, legitimate conversation to be had, but I do think that Congress has done what Congress needs to do, which is exercise its authority. They have control over the budget. They have exercised that control, and I think in a responsible way.
Yeah. This may come as a surprise to somebody in the room, but I agree with every word you just heard from Norm. He said it so well, there's very little for me to add. I think I would say 3 things. First of all, I think to your question, Dan, how do we create the next Senator Vandenberg? I think foreign policy credibility has to be earned, and earning that credibility takes time. I think of Senator Dick Lugar, and I think of a Senator Sam Nunn, and I think of people who really earned their stripes because they sat there, and that chairman's and a Norm Coleman. People who sat in that chair for a long period of time and rose through the ranks and really developed a level of credibility and standing and appreciation of foreign policy. So I think, with all the turnover that I've already referenced, I think it's harder right now. I think Bob Corker was rising to that level. He really created, I think, a real bipartisan committee and showed real leadership and took the initiative and expressed himself on so many issues. So that's number one. I think what we need to do is to give that new crop of senators the time to earn their stripes. Secondly, I think it's really important for us to give credit where credit is due, and certainly when it comes to foreign aid budgets. Congress is doing their job, as Norm noted. I mean, they have restored a lot of the cuts that were proposed in recent years, and I think that's critical. But at the same time, I would really emphasize something I also said earlier, which is the level of dysfunction that we see in Washington today creates a natural environment for somebody to fill the void. And to the degree to which Congress is not responding or not dealing on a proactive basis on many of the foreign policy issues, somebody else will. And the administration, the executive branch, is the natural alternative for filling that void. We have a foreign policy, and somebody's going to articulate it. And I think it's really critical that we understand the important role for Congress to do as much as possible to assert itself not only on foreign aid, but on a lot of the foreign policy challenges we're facing today. The final role that I think Congress can play, and frankly I don't think always does as good a job as I wish they would, is actually elevating the day-to-day and week-to-week regular contact with foreign leaders. Foreign leaders come to Washington, and I must say, as the either minority leader or majority leader, I used to ask my colleagues if they would take some time to meet with these foreign leaders, and sometimes it was very hard to persuade them to do so. They were so busy with all their own issues and with things related to their states or their committees that they didn't want to take the time. Nor did they sometimes feel as comfortable as I wish they could on taking trips abroad, on congressional delegation visits. But having those relationships with foreign leaders at all levels is really critical, and that's something that I think Congress can do and should do and doesn't do as often as I would like to see.
You're both, Senators, you're both from farm states, from states with significant agricultural activity. Was it a difficult, were you ever, either of you questioned about why are you spending so much time on foreign policy? Why aren't you spending more time focused on domestic issues? Or kind of one, that's one question. I think another one would be, how did you make the case for your investing time and effort and energy on foreign policy and specifically foreign assistance issues back in your home state? If you could, yeah.
Well, I would say, first of all, one of the biggest myths, and I'm sure Norm has had to deal with this many times, and probably everybody in the room has dealt with it in one form or another, and that is the myth or the misperception about how much we spend on foreign aid. That constantly is in need of correcting. And there are those who actually believe it's as much as 25% of the federal budget when we know it's less than 1%. And people don't really fully appreciate what little commitment we make internationally when we consider all of the importance that it has as we make this investment. So number one, it's just sort of bringing back people's full appreciation of the very small budgetary commitment that we make to foreign assistance in particular. I think in some ways it may be a little bit easier for people in farm states and rural states to make the case, because there isn't a farmer around that doesn't appreciate the need for international markets and international commitment to food programs. And so Food for Peace was a very popular program. The Dole McGovern school lunch program was very, very important, and everybody understood that connection between food, foreign aid, and international and national well-being. So I think that part of it was important. But I think also there is a sentiment, and it's maybe even more persistent today than when I was in Congress, that we ought to be spending our resources and spending our time and making our priorities things here at home. And the more that prevalent view is held, the harder it is to make the case for foreign assistance. So it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
If I can add to that, Tom's right. First of all, from a producer perspective, farmers, they get it. And so agriculture is really important in my state. But by the way, there aren't that many farmers.
That's true.
And so one of my laments was always with the business community, that the business community didn't do a better job of explaining to their employees. And there's a lot of business in Minnesota. We've got close to 20 Fortune 500 companies in a relatively small state. International companies, their employees, 3M, half their profit comes from money they make overseas. So all those folks that live in the east side of St. Paul who work for the mining, is what we call 3M, their jobs are contingent upon kind of a robust trade, and their jobs are going to be more assured if you're building a middle class in Africa. And so one of my laments, Tom, is at the business community, I didn't do what I thought was a good enough job of actually educating their employees. It's not a partisan issue. It's both sides of the aisle. And so I think Tom's right, there is that feeling out there. There is a feeling of we need to do more at home. There is a feeling of why you're spending money there when I've got this problem with poor schools right here. But there is that benefit ultimately of generating the economic opportunity, growing the jobs in your home state. And I do think that the business community to this day, I think, needs to play a much more active and aggressive role in communicating why there is benefit from these international connections.
Could you each talk about, I think one of the things that's changed in the last 10 years here in Washington is the challenge of China. And I think that in my experience with the Trump administration has been in the last 2 years that if you make the case for, say, supporting the capital increase at the World Bank Group, or creating a stronger, more capable development finance institution, taking OPIC and putting it on steroids, I would argue that the winning argument for those sorts of activities has been the challenge of China, maybe the fear of China, or sort of great rise, of return, if you will, of great power competition. We had great power competition in the age of Senator Vandenberg with the challenge of the Soviet Union, and that was the backdrop for the institutions that he helped birth. But you've seen this with the great power challenge of China. Could each of you just reflect a little bit, if I say the word China and foreign assistance, if you just, what your reaction is to those two words, if you would?
Well, I think the context has changed over the last 30 years. The context for international influence 30 years ago was the Cold War, and we saw it as a kind of a bipolar contest, the Soviet Union and the United States, and everybody fell into one or the other of those columns, and dominance was determined in large measure in the military context, not the economic. And so, although I don't want to minimize the economic, I think as we talked earlier, the whole Marshall Plan notion, the concept of restoring some degree of economic viability in Europe was certainly heartfelt, with our interest in bringing back the quality of life that Europeans had enjoyed. But it was also a Cold War issue, and it was our determination to keep the Soviet Union from occupying and dominating all of Europe, which we saw as a real national security threat. I think over the last 30 years, in part because of the internet, in part because of technology, but also in part because of, I think, just the liberal order that we've now experienced for 70 years in Bretton Woods, and commerce as it is today, we've become very interdependent. And in so doing, I think we've become very transactional. And I think China has been probably the single most successful country in terms of utilizing this new paradigm to their own benefit. They see how the paradigm has shifted, how the context is different. They no longer necessarily view, although I think that may be changing too, that the military context is as important as it was during the Cold War. They see an economic challenge and an economic competition in this transactional environment to be much more conducive to their opportunities to become much more influential and dominant. And so we see 1,000 Chinese business people show up at a Colombian international trade show and trade conference some time ago. We see them dominant in terms of their presence in Africa and in Latin America and building infrastructure projects. We see them much more visible in an economic context in just about every part of the world today. And as they are, I think they become our real competitor for influence and ultimately for the direction this international community takes.
Yeah, Norm?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in. I'll just kind of build on that. One, I associate myself with the comments of the gentleman from South Dakota, everything that Tom said. But I actually think it is for those of us who care about foreign assistance, those of us who care about America's place in the world, I actually think what China's reach has done has made our job a little bit easier. Anyone who's traveled to Africa, right, China's there. And by the way, they're there, but it's not in a, you talk to the folks in Liberia, you talk to the folks in DRC, China, they want resources. It's very transactional. They build highways, but they bring in Chinese, or in fact, they bring in Chinese labor to do it. And so you've got the host countries oftentimes are not really getting a long-term benefit. It's very transactional. And so, we need to be there. And I think American policymakers see that, and Americans are competitive. And one of our, Latin America is the same. Tom mentioned Colombia, but you head to Brazil, you head to Argentina. China is there. And so the Chinese presence, and again, China is there, and it's because it's not humanitarian. They're there because they need resources to fuel a Chinese economy that has incredible needs to kind of grow at a certain level in order to feed their populations, which are moving, by the way, from rural areas to urban areas. And so they've got huge economic challenges. They can only be satisfied by minerals and energy kind of coming from other places in the world. I think it creates, for American policymakers, perhaps, they see that on the horizon, and I hope, Tom, that motivates them to be more active and to be more aggressive and to do more outreach so that we, in the end, don't cede all this opportunity and all these relationships to China.
Can we talk about values? I'm on the board of IFAS, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and we think about democracy and human rights, and that there's been a tension in American foreign policy. I think there's also reflected a little bit in our foreign assistance about how much do we act only on our interests? Do we act on our values or aspirational values of who we hope to be and the kind of world we want to have? But I also think Arthur Vandenberg was very much, I think, implicit in sort of standing up the United Nations, both explicitly and implicitly. There was the Human Rights Charter. There were a whole series of assumptions about the kind of world that we wanted to have, and the finger was on the scale of democracy, and the finger was on the scale of human rights, and the finger was on the scale of good governance. Could you just talk a little bit about how we should think about our values and how we should think about democracy and human rights in this conversation about our assistance and how we should think about this?
Well, I'm one who always has subscribed to this 4D philosophy that defense, diplomacy, development, and democracy ought to be our goals. And that I think in the last 10 years in particular, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Economist Intelligence Unit. They come up with an annual report on democracy and have noted that for the last decade we've seen a decline in the quality of democracy around the globe, including here in the United States, and that we have to be somewhat concerned about the degree to which authoritarian rule seems to be on the rise, nationalism in particular. And so the real question is, to what extent do we subscribe to putting that value as part of our priority? I have served on the National Democratic Institute board as the vice chair with Madeleine Albright now for about the last 10 years. And I still believe that giving people the opportunity to have a voice in their own destiny, in their own country, makes a lot of sense. That's really what we are all about. That's really, if not us, who? And it just seems to me that as we consider the other priorities, development, democracy, defense, that there has to be some role there too for ensuring that people have an opportunity to express themselves, to voice their opinion, to pick their leaders. And we can't be dictatorial. We can't tell them what kind of government they should have, but we ought to create as much as we can an environment that gives them that choice. And that seems to me something that I don't think we've probably emphasized as much as we should in recent years.
Yeah, thanks.
I served on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for 9 years, and so this is an issue that is still close to my heart. Democracies don't go to war against each other. Just quality of life. I think it's important, but it's a very touchy issue nowadays, Tom. Some folks say, "Are we promoting democracy? Is that the American image?" And not everyone agrees that that American image is the best. I think it is, but not everyone believes in American exceptionalism. And again, on the left and the right, you have forces there that kind of say, something, we don't need to be promoting anything but our own interests here at home. And so I think that's a challenge. And so to me, it's important. I keep getting back to how do we kind of build a strong center to promote American interests, defense, and it's the 4 Ds. How do we do that? But the most delicate one is the last one, democracy. And I recognize the debate over that, about how much do we put into that? At what point do we have folks who are simply our allies strategically in a geographic area, but they don't represent the same perspective on democracy that we have here? We work with monarchies; they're not democracies, and so it is an issue that's important to me. I recognize the kind of the delicate ground in which we walk when we talk about that.
Just the last question for both of you. I think we've always had forces in the United States. At the time of Arthur Vandenberg, there were forces of isolationism or a temptation to, whatever you want to call it, either come home America or rebuild, focus on America first, or whatever you want to call it. And there's sort of various forces in both parties, and they've been with us for a long time. I think it's not a question of them going away, but sometimes they come back. And could each of you just talk a little bit about the dynamics in each of your respective political parties, that some of the dynamics of what are some of the centrifugal forces that are pulling against, if I can put it that way, and what can we do in both parties to try and bring folks back to the center? If you could each talk about this.
So I played an active role in the Lindsey Graham for President campaign. It didn't go very far, but I can tell you that what motivated Senator Graham was that he wanted to ensure that the conversation in our party kind of focused around American involvement, America being out there as a force in the world, a positive force. And I believed in that. I mean, we have within my party, there is an isolationist wing of the party. Senator Paul would say that's kind of in essence perhaps where he stands. I would tell you, by the way, that America first doesn't mean America not involved in the world. In fact, I think support of foreign assistance is consistent with America First. That if you care about America First, you want to make sure that we're engaged. You want to make sure that we're economically strong. We're going to be economically strong if we can deal with 95% of the world's consumers who are out there. If you care about American First, you want to make sure that Midwest farmers have markets in which they can sell their product to, not just domestically. And so I think there are the elements, again, on both sides of the aisle that tend into the isolationist, kind of separating us. And I just don't think you can do it. It's not smart. It doesn't make sense. It's not in America's security interest. It's not in our economic interest. And fundamentally, it's not in who we are as Americans, in which I really do believe that we believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And we have been given much. And I think that element in American kind of the impact of the churches and the synagogues and the faith-based community, I think that's an important part of kind of what moves America, what makes us so special, and I think is important then in terms of promoting a robust foreign assistance agenda.
Senator Coleman, does it also require that in both parties that we identify and recruit people to run and support people who are internationalists?
The answer is absolutely yes, and I think it's one of the great challenges. It's one of the challenges that this is a whole other discussion about how do you move away from being the most extreme element in one party. In the old days, if you wanted to get elected, you moved into a neighborhood, you maybe joined the Lions Club or the Chamber, you did this and that. Someone says, notice this bright young woman, this bright young man said, why don't you run for school board? You ran for school board, and then somebody says, well, you should run for Congress or Senate, and you're part of the community. Today, you can sit in your mother's basement and write a blog about, that appeals to the most extreme element in your party. And since we have such divisions, because of the nature of reapportionment, that all you have to be is get votes in your party. You don't even care about the other side. Then all of a sudden you get elected. So we have this. It's a longer discussion, but I do think it's incumbent on the folks in this room and those who are listening to be supportive of those folks that understand America's place in the world and that support that. But it's getting harder and harder in this environment for that to happen, Dan.
Senator Coleman, I have a visual of a 20-something in Sesame Street pajamas sending blog posts out, and I think that's probably an accurate visualization of what you're describing. I agree. So, Senator Daschle, I don't know necessarily there's the same sort of, are there the same kind of dynamics in the Democratic Party? Are there forces that pull either sort of focus domestically, or I know the Republican Party better than the Democratic Party, so I'd defer to you.
Well, I think on the left there's an international fatigue that comes after 19 years of Iraq and Afghanistan that is driving a large part of the perception about where we go and how reticent we ought to be about engaging abroad. You know, I can understand that, but at the same time, I think we have to look at the fact that we've had troops in Europe now for 70 years.
Yeah.
We've had troops in South Korea for 70 years, and that commitment to a presence has allowed an international stability that I think we would be really remiss if we took for granted. We really have to appreciate that international presence has created an international order that has allowed for a stability that has created enormous economic growth. And so I understand the fatigue and somewhat sympathetic to it, but I don't think that, I think it's the wrong lesson to learn that somehow making commitments internationally is as a result of Iraq and Afghanistan, something we should not do. Now, it seems to me one of the other issues is how do we make that commitment to an international presence? And I would like to think, and I would hope we could find ways to do it on a multilateral basis. I was a big TAP supporter. I think economic...
Sorry, TF.
The International Trade Program for Asia.
TPP.
TPP, I mean.
Yep.
TAP was the European. TTIP and TPP. But
lots of acronyms.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's been a while since I've
referred
to either. But my point is that international trading relationships is one way for the United States to remain engaged. And there was a lot of Democratic opposition to TPP and TAP, and I regret that. I think in the last election, both presidential candidates were against TPP, regrettably, in my view. So I think we've got to look at not only our military engagement, but our economic relationship, and I think the degree to which we can understand the importance of multilateral commitments and multilateral organizational approaches, the better off we're going to be. Let
me tell you a story about free trade, because I'm a big believer in free trade, but I think it's taken a real whacking. I'm not sure it's not a real vote getter in either party, and I suspect we're going to have in 2020 two candidates that don't necessarily support further free trade are going to have the very most is a very timid or cautious support. I had a very close friend of mine from college. I helped him get elected in a state I'm not going to mention, but he's not from, and he's a good friend of mine, and I helped him for a long time get elected. And I called him because my wife and I really care about free trade, and I said, you really ought to support President Obama's there was like the fast track initiative. I said, I really hope you're going to support President Obama on this, because this is important. He was a Republican, and he said, well, look, I'm in a district that it's not popular. I'm getting 100 calls a day ginned up by unions to call my office, and he just didn't even really like it. He kind of, I think, he wasn't really somebody. I mean, he was probably a couple espresso cups further on me on a number of different issues, but it just was so disappointing. And so some of it it wasn't a winner for him. It was hard for him to justify, either in terms of either sort of an electoral calculus or a re-election calculus. Now, ultimately, I think we have to support people who believe in this stuff. But there was a whole bunch of disincentives for him to support it. It was very disappointing.
Well, we really can't be, I think we have to be sensitive to the enormous disruption and dislocation that is part of this new globalized environment within which we work. I think there are myths around
Or
the
myths.
lost jobs issue that have to do with automation a lot. I mean, just an enormous amount of automation these days, and with now with artificial intelligence, I think you're going to see even an acceleration of automation and robotics in manufacturing in particular. So I think we really have to make sure people understand where the job dislocation in part is coming from, but I think we also need to do a better job on a bipartisan basis to find a way to respond to these very legitimate concerns. There are some great documentaries out about the impact that this dislocation has had in many states, and I don't think there's a state that's gone unscathed by it. So we have to be appreciative of that and address it more effectively through public policy than we have. But that doesn't mean you abandon just the extraordinary importance of having those international economic relationships and finding a way to work through the challenges that come with them.
But Dan, I think it's important to recognize that this is not just a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. So look at Brexit. I think sometimes some of us, Tom, have perhaps kind of lost sight of the degree of angst that is out there. That folks look at their situation and say, globalization hasn't helped me. This global order that we talk about that may have helped big business, but it's not helping the little guy. And so you see it in Brexit, you see it in the movements in a number of countries of a very kind of nationalistic and a very self-centered moving away. And that's because not everyone is benefiting from the things we're talking about. So I think it's incumbent upon policymakers to do a much better job of figuring out how to make sure people understand why it is in their interest. And in fact, they have to do things to make sure it is in their interest.
Let me take the chair's prerogative. I want to call in a couple of my friends, and I want to hear from my friend Lori Rowley. I want to hear from my friend Bill Sweeney, and I want to hear from my colleague and friend Michael Levitt. I'd welcome each of you. I'm going to start with my friend Lori Rowley up front here. I'm thrilled you're here.
Thank you.
Here's
Thanks for having this program.
So remind everyone who you are.
Okay, I am Lori Rowley. I'm with the Lugar Center. So thank you, Senator, for your fine comments about Senator Lugar. At our center, we work on a number of issues. One of them is supporting foreign assistance. Right now, we're doing a project called Building Champions of Foreign Assistance. And one of the things we've done is a series of case studies on effective transitions from foreign assistance of a number of countries across the world. We just finished 4, and we have about 5 more in the pipeline. And I really want to thank you for your comments about that 4th pillar of democracy, because as our team looked around the world and tried to find some really great examples, not South Korea because it's the one everyone used, and we've used it a lot, but some other countries, and wanted to have some good regional diversity of those countries. Some of them are still transitioning, but many are doing really well. One of the things we found is democracy is very strong in these countries. So I'm thinking about a couple in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain with regard to Poland and Bulgaria. I'm thinking about Tunisia following the Arab Spring, and the need of people to really want to have a voice in their own lives and governance. And I'd like to kind of push you both on that question. What else can we do to really promote that? Because if you look at where foreign assistance goes, we talked about global health and global food security, but democracy kind of comes in right at the end almost as an afterthought. But it seems like it really is that intimate final piece of the success.
Thank you. Bill Sweeney.
Good afternoon. First, congratulations to all of you for some terrific contributions at an important time. I'm Bill Sweeney. I just stepped down as president of IFAS at the end of last year. Not to continue on the democracy theme, I'd like to enter another theme, and that's called competition. During the Cold War, over the issues of defense, as Senator Daschle said, there were 2 buckets to go in. Now there are 2 or 3 or 4 buckets to go in. And my fear is that we as a country have lost the sense of competition, that there are forces out there that want to dislodge us, as a philosophical leader in terms of promoting our values, as well as an economic leader, as well as a defense leader. And so it's that question that I'd like to get your focus on. Have we lost the competitive edge?
Thank you. Michael Levitt.
Thank you. Hi, I'm affiliated here at CSIS, but I used to run development organizations and spend a lot of time in the field. So 2 points and 1 question. One, with TPP, I thought it was a terrible trade deal, but totally supported it because of its implications in foreign policy. And I thought the Obama administration was amazing in never telling us about the importance of foreign policy, only the trade implications. And I think we lost support on what was a very important issue. Second, on convincing people on foreign assistance, I've worked and done well by AID, the worst single agency in my career in blowing their own horn. You don't know what they do. You don't know how they do it. You don't know who succeeded. They don't tell us. Again, I've been part of some of the successes. They can't tell me what they were. They can give you on some things on food and some things on health. But in general, the great things we did in Bulgaria in building democracy or the economy, the Europeans didn't do that. AID did that over and over and over again. I happened to be there, so I can tell you about them, but I asked AID, they never blew their own horn. So I think that's a big thing. But my question is, can you sell values in the United States and democracy if you have a president who likes people who aren't Democrats and who denies values? Serious question.
Serious question. Okay. Gentlemen?
Well, first how can we further promote democracy? It seems to me that one of the things that I also don't think gets the credit it deserves is the education and cultural exchanges we have. I know when I travel abroad, it's always amazing to me and so reassuring to talk to foreign leaders who say, I went to school in X. I mean, it's really remarkable the degree to which current leaders in countries all over the world got some of their higher education, if not all of it, here in the United States. I think we're making it harder and harder for that to continue. And that's a huge mistake. When they learn about cultural values, when they learn about our freedoms, when they learn about our opportunities for advancement and the competitive environment within which we work, they take those things back. And they may not subscribe, as we see with President Xi, and they may not take them back and employ them. But I can't help but believe that, maybe except for President Xi, it's had a real effect on a lot of other leaders all over the world. As to Bill, our losing our competitiveness, I think to a certain extent, we've just not put the emphasis on it that we should, either in public policy or otherwise. I do think that the international corporate community, and Norm can speak to this a lot better than I can, but I do think that there's a desire to be competitive internationally in the corporate sector, but I don't think we always have created as much of an opportunity through the public sector to be as supportive as we should be. And I would cite again our lack of commitment to international trading relationships to do that, or foreign assistance, or any one of a number of other things. So this really is a public-private partnership that, in my view, could be a lot more aggressive, a lot more assertive, and a lot more visible than it is today. And so I think, and then to your last question, I think it does make our challenge all the greater to have a president who has embraced totalitarian and authoritarian leaders abroad. But we've talked earlier about the role of Congress, and we've talked earlier about the importance of the role that Congress can take here. It seems to me that we have a responsibility in Congress to elevate our profile, to speak out, and to address these challenges in a more effective way, and to build those relationships with leaders who can reflect more of the democratic values that we all adhere to and aspire to. So I think that will always be an issue, but I think not that we can overcome it, we can certainly begin to address it.
Senator Coleman.
So the democracy is one that's challenging for me because I've always strongly believed in it. And yet my concern is that the Arab Spring wasn't such a spring. It's not been a good thing around the world. It has not kind of yielded the benefit perhaps the Obama administration thought it would when it first occurred. So and maybe all these questions tie together. I think we do well, and I think we're competitive because we are still the center of innovation. We are the center of opportunity. And the things that we do, and this is where having a president who understands those things, we do to make ourselves economically strong, which requires a global market, which requires global interaction, which benefits from having countries with greater stability. And you tend to have greater stability if people are more empowered and not feeling cut off and not feeling isolated. So I think a robust domestic economic agenda can actually yield good results if we have people, by the way, who can cross the aisle and work in a bipartisan fashion, who understand America's place in the world is critical to them. So I actually think it's interesting. In my mind, these questions tie together. They're all tough individually, but if you kind of pull it together and say America is still the shining city on the hill, it's still the place where people want to go. It's still the place where they want to start business. I once asked Bill Gates about 15 years ago when I was in the Senate. I said, when is China going to overtake the U.S.? And he said to me, he said, not so quick. He said, because you have something that is really special. What he's talking about. He said, land-grant colleges, University of Minnesota. And he says, we have a 100-year tradition of teaching innovation and entrepreneurship and a commitment to research. He said, and I'll take one American-trained engineer over 10 Chinese or Indian-trained engineers. I asked him that same question 2 years ago. And he said, the gap may be shortening, but we're still there. So my point is that if we do those things that promote economic opportunity, promote entrepreneurship, that makes America still the shining city on the hill, and are wise enough to have in place those things that support turning Colombia from a state controlled by narco-terrorists to now our ally in that battle, that generates a middle class in China, in Africa, okay, that is going to be a home to products from our market. I think we'll do okay. So I am very optimistic in spite of all the challenges raised by these three questions.
All right, let's take one or two comments more. This gentleman here. Okay, and this gentleman here. Yes.
Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Julian Goldstein. I'm a sophomore in international relations major at Howard University. And I've been coming to events up along Massachusetts Avenue since I was maybe about 16.
And this is the best one you've ever been to.
Definitely one for
You're
the history
welcome.
books. So on that same point relating to trade with China and more so counter-influencing or that same dominance and competition, post TPP. I believe just this week, The Economist had reported that the president of Italy and China had signed a new Rome agreement to revive the Silk Road, which had been the world superhighway since 3,000 years, essentially. And on that same topic, although I'm not sure if you could call it a wet war to coin the term, when it comes to U.S. Military competition with China in areas such as the South China Sea, as well as the Indian Ocean, where we also see them starting to use their debt trap diplomacy to create military bases. Could you give me your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Thanks. Those are good questions. Sir.
Hi, thank you, everybody. My name's David, and my question is about Congo, specifically the Ebola outbreak and security concerns there. So I've had the opportunity to work on PEPFAR, and my understanding is that that was successful because it kind of broke down those traditional aid silos of health and security and addressed a health issue as a national security issue as well. Can you draw from experiences of where breaking down those traditional silos can help, if PEPFAR maybe is a good example to draw from, or if you can think of any others as well?
Okay, good.
Great, by the way, great questions. And let me, first I want to just about China first, and I want to get to the health question. But I think that we are in, the relationship with China is complex. They are both our competitor. Okay, there's no, but in the way that there's a little codependency, we'd like to sell into those Chinese markets. In order to do that, we've got to make sure that our IP isn't ripped off. We've got to make sure that we have access to those markets. And by the way, Chinese investment is not a bad thing in this country. But again, being sensitive to some of the national security issues and some of the IP issues. And so but I think this competition is healthy, and I think American business will rise to the competition. I think our government, though, plays a role in there, as I talked about in my earlier responses. China is active in doing all sorts of projects and in creating infrastructure in Latin America and in Africa. And so we have to be competitive in that regard. We cannot be off the playing field. But I do think if we give an opportunity for American business to be on the playing field, and by the way, allow it to be competitive in terms of tax structure and other things, I think we can meet that challenge. And so I am, Xi has this vision of this Silk Road, he'll play that out. But you go around the world, people still want American investment, they want American technology, they want American innovation, they want American quality. And so I think we win that battle, and I actually think it's a stimulus and a motivation for policymakers to see that we're in a competition and then to rise to that competition, not in a way in which we're going to war and battle, but a way in which Americans do well, and that's compete on an economic playing field and persevere, and we win. Really interesting questions. I mean, I saw the PEPFAR change. I saw the change that was done in AIDS, and it's a real important issue to me. And I haven't studied kind of where we've gone from that, but I think one of the things that I give the folks over at USAID credit for is I think in the last 2 years, both under leadership under Obama with Russia and leadership now with Mark Green, I think they understand that. I think we're in a much better place. I don't think AID was an easy target for us when I was in the Senate. AID has always been an easy target for saying, well, the ways go. But if you look at kind of the things that are going on and you tie it into kind of the things we do with MCC, I think we're in a much better place. And by the way, these are national security imperatives. Okay? There's not just a health issue. Okay? If we don't deal with Ebola, that's a national security. You remember kind of the impact a few years ago that we had here. And so I just think I hope I'm not being too optimistic here, but I think we do a much better job today than we did certainly 6 or 7 years ago in breaking down the silos, in trying to make sure that USAID is seen as being an effective tool of American diplomacy and humanitarian efforts around the world. I think we're doing much, much better, and I'm happy to see that MCC continues long after, as I said, I was there in the very beginning when it first started. And I think it's a very effective and valuable tool for American diplomacy.
Senator Coleman, let me just jump in. I think the issue of the Ebola response, I think there were two things I would say. One is, I think we got like 100-0 vote in the Senate to pay for more money, but both here and abroad, understanding that our national security and our security, that you couldn't build a wall big enough to stop Ebola. Like Ebola doesn't kind of respect walls or any kind of physical barriers. That for a whole bunch of reasons, because of urbanization, because of more airplane flights, and because of change in human diets, there's a lot more animal husbandry, and so there's a lot more funny diseases can jump from animals to people. So there's going to be a lot more funny. Every 3 to 4 years, we're going to have a funny name disease that I can't pronounce, but I know we're going to get one of these like clockwork. I don't wish it, but I just think it's real. And we got, I think it was like 100-0 in 2014. I think Rand Paul voted for, paying whatever it was going to cost to make sure that Ebola didn't show up. And I think if we talk about, if I go into certain government leaders' offices and say, I want to talk about health system strengthening in Sierra Leone, I think they want to fall asleep. But if I say, do you want 2 Ebola-infected nurses showing up at Newark Airport? They're very interested in that conversation. So sometimes it's about, I think the aid community in particular, and of which I'm a part, commits a sin of talking in technocratic gobbledygook that isn't accessible to Earth people. And then it leads to people saying, what the heck are you guys talking about? Can we just explain to me in Earth people terms what the heck you're talking about, or make it relevant to me? So I think it's a really good question. The other point I want to make is, I think if we hadn't led on fixing Ebola, I think some of these challenges, these humanitarian responses, as well as some of these larger development challenges, I think it's part of the condo fees of global leadership. And to the extent we don't answer the mail, I think it's sort of like we lose our moral authority to lead the world. And so I thought if we didn't get Ebola right in 2014, there was a lot more at stake than there was a lot at stake in terms of a whole lot of people were going to die, including in this country. But I actually thought it was kind of like keeping the plate spinning on sort of our moral authority to lead the world, if I can put it that way. But anyways, Senator Daschle.
Well, you both have said it so well. I would just add on the Ebola question, it'd be a huge mistake for us to think it was over. I mean, we have over 1,000 cases in the DRC right now, and it's impossible for us to go in to treat it because of the conflict that is ongoing. And as a result of that conflict, it is absolutely inevitable that this is going to spread again. To a certain extent, I think we're a victim of our own success. We won the first round on the Ebola fight, and I worry a lot that we're just not doing as much as we need to be prepared for what is certain to be another round. But I think the Ebola effort is a good example of tearing down silos, as was PEPFAR and the MCC. I mean, we are doing a better job of recognizing the new environment and the new landscape and creating organizational ways with which to address all of that more effectively. I would also say that social media has changed everything. I mean, just the degree to which we are now connected to people all over the world instantaneously, communicating with. I just spoke this morning several times with somebody from South Africa, and it was like he was
right here
where Dan is. I mean, it's really amazing how technologically advanced we are and how that's changing the way we communicate and interrelate. And that will continue, both on a plus, and I think there are some disadvantages as well. As we saw, we don't know, I don't want to get into controversies here that are unnecessary, but, I worry a lot about foreign intervention technologically in our election process and things like that going forward. And I think, I think we have to recognize that this technological advancement requires us to think a lot differently, both proactively and defensively, than we have at any time in the past.
Well, look, I'm just so glad to have you both here. Thank you both for doing this. This is just really tremendous. I am so grateful to both of you. I'm also really grateful to Hank Meyer and the Meyer Family Foundation for helping do this. We're going to be having future events like this. I'm so grateful. Please join me in thanking my panelists. Thank you very much.